You are a professor in law at Harvard University, but you also advise and counsel governments, the United Nations, on aspects of health as a human right.
But the idea that there's a right to health does mean that there's certain preconditions like clean water and sanitation, as well as access to care, and that the government has a role to play in leveling the playing field about who gets access.
Sitting on these decision-making forums, how do you perceive power over time, and what does it mean to you personally?
And I think it's also spurred this desire to connect things, as you noted, to connect health with law.
When and how you realized that you wanted to work in this field?
When I went to law school, it was a very exciting time, right as the Cold War was ending. South Africa, Nelson Mandela was walking free. A group of friends began what was then turned into the Center for Economic and Social Rights.
You have been part of some pretty big negotiations, I would say, and also conversations, table discussions. Do you have any best practices and guides to...
So I guess I'd give a few pieces of advice.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Female Empowerment, the podcast. My name is Simone, and I am excited and thrilled to welcome as a guest on this podcast from Harvard University, Professor Alicia Ely-Yamin. Alicia, I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast. We talked briefly about the key topics before, but to go back on what you're doing, to present what you're doing, you are a professor in law at Harvard University, but you also advise and counsel governments, the United Nations, on aspects of health as a human right. This is a very, very fascinating field, and I find your work immensely impressive. But going way back, what made and shaped you? What influenced you? Because I do think the woman or the person we become in life is very often formed and influenced by the people or situations that surround us early on. And I would love to hear your story.
Well, first of all, Simone, I'm so thrilled to be here. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the podcast, which I've really enjoyed all of the sessions I've listened to. I think, both my mother and my father had tremendous influences on me. But to understand the person whom I've become and my professional trajectory, I think it's the combination that really had the greatest influence. So I am a product of two different national backgrounds. My mother's family is from Argentina. My father's family were immigrants to the United States. Two different languages for processing the world, Spanish and English, two different religions. My father was a militant atheist, but of Jewish heritage. My mother was a very devout Christian. Two different social classes. My father's family, my grandparents, whom I adored, were very, very simple. My grandfather was a labor activist, whereas my mother's family were much more of a professional class. And I think those differences that could sometimes be contradictions helped shape my thinking, and recognizing that I had multiple threads of identity within me has, I think, allowed me to connect to others who have walked very, very different paths than my own. And I think it's also spurred this desire to connect things, as you noted, to connect health with law, to connect North and South America in development. So I think that has really been a very formative influence.
We briefly talked about health as a human rights. You are a leading voice in that field. What does that shift mean in practice for governments and communities? Talking about it, we see it it is a human right, but to apply it in the field, there are so many aspects that have to be considered. That's what I mean when I talk, what does that shift in practice mean?
So I think that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked me, because there is a lot of confusion about that. So what does it not mean? It does not mean that you have a right to be healthy, right? Because health depends on so many things, on genetics, on luck often, right? But the idea that there's a right to health does mean that there's certain preconditions like clean water and sanitation, as well as access to care. Not all medical care, but certain care, and that the government has a role to play in leveling the playing field about who gets access. So that changes how we understand health. That health is not just sort of this random biological fate, but it's actually a product of social arrangements, often discriminatory social arrangements that can be changed through legal changes and policy changes. And it also changes what we think about as a right, because you said, well, it is a right. But in the United States, many people would say, no, health is not a right. Rights refer to due process of law or the right to vote, for example. But to say that health is a right means that you have some kind of affirmative claim to health care or to, those other preconditions. And that is quite a different way of thinking about rights, not as shields against the government, but as affirmative entitlements. In the United States, for those of your listeners, that might seem very strange. But actually, the US is an outlier because over 180 countries around the world have enshrined health rights in some form in their legal framework. So they're claimable in courts.
Okay, that's really interesting. So that to sum it up, the framework to have the best environment to be healthy, that is like clean water, what you mentioned, on hygiene in general. That is the framing work that you're talking about.
That is the framing work, and the idea that that's not random who gets access to that the government has a role to play in evening out that access is super important in a rights framework.
Yeah. So we briefly also mentioned that you advise and counsel governments, also the United Nations. It's a really interesting concept of power for me personally, because you have the experience in the field. You are right there, out there in the front lines, so to speak. But you also have a seat on the table when it comes to decision making, not directly, but in advising and what you tell them. What is this like for you, and what are the difference in these two fields?
The difference between advising governments and advising other organizations, or
That at the aspect of advising and also the field work.
oh, well, as you say, I play a lot of different roles, so I'm very acutely aware of the performance of power. So, for example, in a courtroom, the kind of self-reflexive idea with the judges in their robes making decisions, or at the United Nations where you start speeches by saying, Your Excellency, ambassador from this country, or Your Excellency, High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the kind of rituals and performances which also occur in field work, whether, if you're at a village assembly with a paramount chief or traditional elders. And I think in both of those situations, I really try to look at who is framing the discourse, who's framing the discussion, and deciding what gets to be decided and what doesn't get to be decided. And often women and women's issues are silenced in those spaces, or women's health issues, whether it's, abortion or contraception or intimate partner violence, that gets kind of organized out of what can be decided and taken forward. And so I'm very attuned to that.
Wow, this is like a completely new field to me, because if you're not confronted with it directly, you have, I would say, it's safe to say, you have not really an idea what is how the decision making process, the frameworking, how it goes on. Could you let us know when and how you realized that you wanted to work in this field, in this area?
Sure. looking back, it's maybe easier to identify certain specific points than it is when you're going forward and making decisions along the way. But when I went to law school years and years ago, um, a group of friends began what was then turned into the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And all of us wanted to use human rights. That was at Harvard Law School in the years right as the Cold War was ending. And, South Africa, Nelson Mandela was walking free. It was a very exciting time. And all of us wanted to use human rights, not just in the kind of traditional sense of, you know, uh, due process of law or freeing political prisoners, but really to curb economic abuses of power and to try to do something for social inequality. And after I graduated from law school, I had a fellowship to work in Mexico. I spent a lot of time in indigenous communities. And I recall one incident in particular where I ended up watching an infant die of diarrheal dehydration. And that was particularly poignant and moving for me. We were there to investigate other human rights abuses by the military, but the mother that day, there was no health care to speak of. It was a very remote part of Mexico at the time. There were just nuns who gave health care. But the mother that day was devastated, but didn't recognize what had happened to her child, her son, as an injustice. It was a tragedy, but not an injustice in the same way as what the military was doing. And it struck me then that, tragedies elicit lamentation and regret and sympathy, but injustices call for legal and policy reform and remedies. And so it was really then that I thought health is just this very acute reflection of justice and injustice. And I wanted to work on health in that way as a matter of dignity and justice, not as a background factor to other human rights abuses, but really kind of mapping out what would be necessary for people to have equal chances at health.
That story really gave me goosebumps to see, for the people to realize that it wasn't just a tragedy, but also an injustice that happened to them. If you could, and I know this is difficult, but if you could describe your work in a few sentences, how would you explain it?
Actually don't think this is that hard because I do a lot of things, but they're all related. I am a scholar activist who works to promote health equity and social justice with a focus on gender justice. I don't think you can have social justice without gender justice.
At this moment in your career and life, what are you most looking forward to, and are there new directions that you are tapping into?
Well, I think at this particular moment, and we have to say that in 2025, the United States government and President Trump's second administration has really upended public health in the United States as well as around the world by withdrawing US funding and support for multilateral institutions. So my work now is very much focused on that resistance, on activist resistance within the United States to what is going on. And I can't say that I look forward to that, but I'm absolutely 1,000% committed to it. I think if there's something I'm looking forward to is that even before Trump, there were things that needed to be fixed desperately in global governance for health. And this terrible debacle of how USAID has been dismantled and funding for the World Health Organization and United Nations has been withdrawn may give us an opportunity. And I'm engaged in a variety of different forums about this to rethink and create a fairer and more equitable global governance for health that's more gender equitable, but also allows countries from the global south to take a bigger leadership role.
Yeah. You mentioned that you are now in forums that are active in how to rethink and reevaluate the health system, the situation that we're in. I want to tap into that, but more in the concept of power, because sitting on these kinds of forums, decision making forums, how do you have or how do you perceive power over time, and what does it mean to you personally?
I think, again, going back to my first answer, I think power is, I mean, you can say power is the ability to convince somebody else. And there's certainly that in an open courtroom that two sides present arguments. But there's more power in being able to frame how people think about things, how people think about controversial issues. Like in many cases, women's reproductive health are controversial issues. So there's more power in trying to frame people's thinking, and in and I guess in challenging, in upending some of the things that they've taken for granted. And I've tried to do that. I mean, I think all of our discussion about reframing health as a human right, reframing reproductive rights as rights, not just as government policy that can, be pronatalist or antinatalist or whatever about whatever the country needs to do about its demographic policy, but really focused on rights, I think is an extraordinary power and not one that I take lightly. I think it's very important to um, especially as women. Um, it is still the case that people expect women to become hysterical, often in these very high stakes negotiations and
Or maybe
forums,
even emotional.
or emotional. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's especially important not to fall into those traps, to be very prepared, to be practiced in maintaining equanimity and calm, even when, and often women are personally attacked. Women are judged by how they present themselves in addition to the actual arguments they make. So I think that is especially important for women to consider, unfortunately, because it's really a double standard.
That's a double standard. You're I'm with you on that completely. Last but not least, and I'm really looking forward to this considering your entire career. What is the advice you have for people who not only want to tap into activism or but in general decision making and change making positions?
So I guess I'd give a few pieces of advice. One would be to really seek out mentors that you admire or who inspire you. When I was coming up, there were fewer of those people, but I was very lucky to work with some just amazingly brave, especially women, not all women, but especially women who just have incredibly inspired me throughout my life. The second would be not to listen to the people who say it's impossible, because I have been told so many times that what you're trying to do is impossible. When I wanted to work on creating an legally enforceable right to health, especially in the case of maternal health, I was told by an expert who worked with the World Health Organization, you might as well dedicate your life to weaving coats out of butterfly wings. Because, of course, you can't. Weaving coats out of butterfly wings is so
Yeah.
absurd that it seemed absurd. So don't listen to those people. Persist, persist, persist. And the final piece of advice I would give is follow your own path. don't try to follow in somebody else's footsteps to succeed in the way that somebody else has succeeded. My life is an example of this. It's a very, in many ways, odd trajectory that combines academia and activism, law and public health. I've lived in a number of different countries on a number of different continents, but it's not a career that anybody else could have had. And I would encourage young women, especially, to think outside the box, not to try to follow in somebody else's pattern, but to be their own people.
Thank you so much for mentioning it. Its persistence is so key, but also the other aspects that you mentioned. You have your own identity. That also means you have your own path, and it will not look the same to other person's paths. Yeah. So thank you so much for mentioning it. I think sometimes we hear that, but we don't really listen. So it's the more important that we repeat it as often as we can because it takes you to new places in your life. That has been the case for
Absolutely. And
me.
it's hard. It's hard to do that. It's so much easier to follow a playbook that somebody else has set out. So, you know, be patient with yourselves as you carve your own path.
Thank you so much for mentioning. I love the last sentence you mentioned. I love it. So this is a great time now to tap into the fast question and answer session. Thank you, by the way, for sharing about your professional trajectory, your life, the experiences you've had, but also how you see the world. That's most important of all. We want to get to know you personally a bit better now. And my first question is, you've lived in the US and abroad. No, sorry, both in the US and Argentina in this question, sorry. In both countries, are there like nostalgic places that you love to go to that really gives you the feeling, oh, I'm now home in this country?
Well, I have lived in Argentina and the US, and I have to say, without a doubt, my two favorite cities in the world are Buenos Aires, Argentina, and New York. And they're very, in some ways, similar. They have the same kind of vibe of intensity and culture. But I will say, and this might surprise you, Simone, that I think Borges said that nostalgia for places is really not about the place, but about the time that you spent there. And I would say I am most nostalgic because I continue to go to Buenos Aires and New York. I'm most nostalgic for Peru. I lived there at a very important time in my life when my children were very young. I lived there at a very important time in my professional life when I felt completely fulfilled. I was part of a larger movement for health rights and for democratization, and really forged friendships that have lasted a lifetime. So I would say nostalgia. And Peru is just an extraordinary country. So that's the place I would say I'm most nostalgic about.
You really surprised me with that answer, but I love it, and it's true. The time you spend there. That's amazing. Thank you for mentioning it. The next question is, if you could have any historic person as a mentor, who would it be?
Would choose Hannah Arendt, who is a German American philosopher, political theorist. I've always followed her and read her with interest and cited her a lot in my work. She talks a lot about um, commitment to being in the public, to living your life in public and having political commitments. But I think now she also writes a lot about authoritarianism and totalitarianism and uh, dangers in society. She writes about the human condition. And I think her writing now is particularly useful to think about the situations that we find ourselves in.
Is there a book you could recommend from her?
I would say The Human Condition is a great book to read. Yeah. The
I'll
Origins of Totalitarianism, another one. Great book.
I'll link them below. Thank you so much. It's just for me, by the way, the question, and for everyone who is interested in it, because I think I try to upgrade my reading list every now and then to keep updated and also to, just to keep be informed and also span to newer horizons. that is also directly connected to my next question. A book that you recently, well, recently-ish read and that made you change your mind on a certain issue or topic.
So this is actually a little bit related. A book that I recently read, which I would recommend to all of the podcast listeners, is Rebecca Solnit's Orwell's Roses. Rebecca Solnit is just a luminous writer whenever she writes about stuff. She's written about mansplaining and things. But this book is about George Orwell's, who wrote 1984 and other books about his kind of private life and love of gardening. And
Interesting.
it changed my perception of him, and it also changed my perception that the cultivation of beauty in our private lives can be a form of resistance. And she does a beautiful job in weaving that argument together. So that's also in this particular time quite meaningful to me. So I'd recommend the book.
Wow, I will definitely link them down below. I find them, from what you've said, I find them incredibly fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. The next question goes a bit in a different direction. You have been part of some pretty big negotiations, I would say, and also conversations, table discussions. Do you have any best practices and guides to have a good stand in any negotiation?
So I think this goes back a little bit to what I was saying before about preparation, because as women, we are constantly underestimated. And so to be very aware of how you're presenting, as unfortunate as it is that there is that double standard, but also to hyper prepare, so you don't fall into those traps. And it's not easy for anybody to dismiss you. And also to prepare for being thrown off and to recover.
Yeah, that is. So you would practice the argument just in case to see in which direction it could go and prepare for
Oh,
every
in
outcome.
in presenting expert testimony in a court or something, I would always want to practice and with people who could then ask me pointed questions. Yeah, no, I would always want to do that. And when I write some written testimony or written advice, I would also want to check in with people and be questioned, because it's not so much just putting out the ideas, it's when people disagree with you and start firing questions at you that you can easily get flustered if you haven't prepared.
That's true. That's true. I feel sometimes as women, we are being underestimated, of course, but also that in my case, I would say I would have to really get into practicing that because I'm a person who gets easily thrown off. So thank you for mentioning that. Our practice is it's the key. Yeah.
It's just practice, Simone. It really, nobody likes to be thrown off or cross-examined. So it's really practice.
Thank you for reassuring me in that aspect. Thank you so much. Are there any habits or routines that you maintain that you have in order to maintain your resilience, your focus, and also some sort of balance in both your professional life and personal life?
Um, Well, I think over the course of my career, having kids has helped a lot because it really does balance work and the kind of focused intensity on just working and make you realize that there's so much more in life. I think also exercise, regular exercise, and feeling your body and, allowing your mind to rest. Sometimes I don't know if especially as women, but sometimes we think, oh, I'm so tired, I want to sleep and relax, or I want a vacation where I just read a book on the beach. And actually I have found that exhausting myself physically is actually in a way much more liberating from the anxieties of work.
Broadens the your mental capacity, I would say, in order.
Mm.
That's why I love going to the gym. The weights and to really exhaust my body I completely agree with you on that one. And
Yeah.
also the kids
Yeah,
one. I mean, I've heard that people say once you have kids, you will reevaluate your concept of time.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So the next question goes into a completely different direction. You've lived both in the US and in many countries, well, in the US and abroad to say. That gives you the advantage that you have a point of view from inside the country, but also the external point of view. Are there some What is the biggest misconception people have about the US, and what is something they surprisingly get right?
I think the I think especially now, there are many versions of the US, right? So some people outside of the country interact with people like me who are academics or global policy people and assume that all people in the United States are like that, which that's absolutely not the case. Most people in the United States have quite an insular education about US history and US politics, and I think that explains some of our foreign policy and our history of elections. And so there's this disconnect in those people about thinking about, well, all of these people I work with in the United States are very global and international. How I don't understand how their electoral politics could possibly be this way. So I think that's one. And then there's another version where people think the United States is sort of Hollywood movies, which is, in some kind of way, I guess, realistic, but in a lot of ways, not realistic at all, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned it. It's true. People very often reflect their version or what they see in Hollywood, they reflect it on the entire of US. That's really interesting now thinking of it or coming to think of it. What has been a once in a lifetime experience for you?
Oh, Simone, I feel this is going to sound maybe wishy-washy, but I feel like I've had a number of once in a lifetime experiences. I'm
Share them.
so privileged in my job to have, you know, worked with and met people who I think of as heroes. Albie Sachs, the first president of the South African Constitutional Court after apartheid fell, um, that is just extraordinary, and other judges of that caliber and heroic healthcare providers. I've just recently in Argentina, I had this immense privilege of spending a week in a Mapuche Tehuelche indigenous community, living in a household there. Those are experiences that, very, very few people get, whether it's with the justices or with an indigenous leader, a Huichafe, as they're called. And they're not privileges that I take for granted at all.
I would say, well, from what I hear, is you get to see how the world is or the life is through the eyes of other people, and that's a huge. Um, it's not only an advantage; it's just wonderful. So I believe you when you say that you had more than one once in a lifetime experiences. So thank you for sharing that. A hobby that you recently picked up again after some time.
So I'm not sure if this is a hobby. My kids tell me I don't have enough hobbies. But I would say a practice I've picked up again, which I picked up really during the pandemic initially, was reading poetry every day. And I don't do it every day. I stopped for a while and I would do sort of Wordle or something in the New York Times. And then this period has been, challenging in the United States for all of the reasons we discussed. And I've started again to read more poetry because I find if you read a poem first thing in the morning, the words and the images keep circulating in your head. And that is a much better place to be than thinking about the pandemic all day or about what is going on, where you hear on the news constantly all day. So I've started that again.
I was just going to say, don't start with the news because that'll like kind of drag you
Right.
into not
Exactly.
such a good
Exactly.
place. Yeah. So that's wonderful. Yeah, poetry. I think the words, the phrasing, it's really beautiful and it takes you into so many different places because you can interpret it in different ways. What is the impact that you want to leave behind? What, considering or thinking now, which impact or what impact do you want to leave behind?
Um, I've always hoped that the work I did would contribute as part of a collective effort to building legal standards and institutional practices that would let people, all people, but possibly women in particular, live healthier lives of dignity, right? To be able to choose the way they wanted to live their lives. And that has a lot to do with health decisions. Um, and even now that we're facing a lot of backlash and retrogression, I hope that some of that work persists. And I hope that by teaching, by working with younger people, by talking to you and the younger listeners of your podcasts, that they can build on things that I have done and take them forward. Because that is the goal. You do it, it's iterative. What I do will go to a certain point, and then you'll carry the torch, or others will carry the torch. And that's always the goal. And that's my hope.
Thank you so much for sharing that. This torch, or like taking over the torch, I find it's a really nice and great way to describe what is actually happening, and especially between generations. We can learn from your experiences, and because we have the advantage now that women like you, they make the world a better place, so we can take on from that. So first of all, thank you so much for doing your work, for the impact you leave behind, and also for taking the time to be here and share your experiences with us, and yeah, to encourage us, I would say, most of all. So thank you so much, Alicia.
It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege, Simone.